My mother-in-law hugged me at the wedding like I was made of something fragile and precious, like spun glass she was afraid to break. She pressed her cheek to mine, and I felt the wet warmth of her tears against my skin. "My little girl," she whispered. "I finally have my little girl." I believed her. God help me, I believed every single word. I didn't know then that love, for Eleanor Hartwell, was just another tool, the sharpest one in her drawer. I didn't know that 3 months after that wedding, I would be standing barefoot in a cold hallway at midnight, pressing my palm flat against the wall like I could hold the whole house together with one hand, listening to my husband and his mother, quietly and methodically, plan the end of everything I thought was real. I ran that night. My feet carried me out the front door before my mind even decided to move. The damp grass was cold under my bare feet, and the night air hit my face like a slap, and I kept running down the dark suburban street in my pajamas, because if I stopped moving, I thought I would simply cease to exist. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that the life I had been living, the warm, golden, ordinary life I had built with my own hands, had just been revealed as a stage set, beautiful from the front, nothing but wooden frames and hollow air from behind. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the life I had before that midnight. Let me tell you about Sarah Hartwell, née Calloway, who used to believe that family meant safety. I had met Daniel at a conference in Boston, one of those stiff, fluorescent-lit professional events where everyone is slightly too formal and the coffee is always burnt. He was presenting on urban development projects, and I was there representing my firm's architecture division, and he'd knocked his lanyard badge into my coffee cup while reaching past me for a handout. We'd both laughed, and that laugh, easy, unguarded, completely real, had felt like finding a window in a room I hadn't known was sealed shut. We dated for 2 years. He was thoughtful and steady, the kind of man who remembered which brand of tea you preferred and bought it without being asked. He called his mother every Sunday, which I thought was sweet. He deferred to her opinion on small things, restaurants, gift choices, holiday plans, which I thought was endearing. Eleanor had lost her husband when Daniel was 16, and they were close in the way that motherless sons and their mothers sometimes are, a tight, scarred-over bond with its own private language. Eleanor was 61 when Daniel and I got married. She had silver hair she kept in a neat bun, and she wore linen blouses in shades of cream and pale blue, and her house smelled of lavender sachets and something slightly medicinal underneath, like old vitamins. She had a way of tilting her head when she looked at you that felt like assessment, though she always followed it with a warm smile, so you told yourself you'd imagined the calculation in her eyes. She had liked me in the beginning, or at least performed liking me with enough consistency and detail that I couldn't tell the difference. She complimented my work. She asked about my projects with what seemed like genuine interest. She brought homemade soup when I had a cold 2 months into my relationship with Daniel, arriving at my apartment door with a sealed container and a worried expression, and I'd thought, this woman is going to be a gift. Our house was mine. That's the part you need to understand before anything else makes sense. I had bought it 2 years before I met Daniel, a narrow Victorian row house in a neighborhood that was just beginning to turn, scaffolding on half the buildings, a new coffee shop on the corner, young couples with strollers moving in alongside families who had been there for 30 years. I had saved for 6 years. I had made the down payment with money I had earned, managed, and protected with the kind of fierce attention you give to something you've built from nothing. The house was registered in my name. It had my name on every document, my name on the deed, my name on the mortgage. When Daniel and I got married, we had agreed, with a handshake and a conversation that felt easy and obvious because we trusted each other, that we would look into refinancing together once we had settled into our new life. There had been no urgency. There had been no paperwork. There had been nothing but trust, which, as it turned out, was exactly the gap Eleanor needed. In the first months of our marriage, she visited every 2 weeks, Sunday dinners mostly, or the occasional Saturday afternoon, where she'd arrive with flowers from a farmer's market and a covered dish she'd made the night before. I welcomed it. I liked cooking and she liked eating, and Daniel was happy when his two worlds overlapped peacefully. And for a while they did. Eleanor would sit at my kitchen table and hold her tea in both hands and talk about her garden, her book club, the neighbors on her street. And I would sit across from her and feel the specific, comfortable warmth of a life that seemed to be working. The first thing I noticed and then deliberately set aside, was her questions about the house. They began casually. She was curious about what I'd paid for it, which I'd chalked up to the generational habit some older people have of asking about money without embarrassment. I gave her a vague answer, and she didn't push. Then she asked about the mortgage terms. Just curious, dear. It's such a confusing process. I always wondered how young people manage it. And again, I answered briefly and moved the conversation on. She asked once about whether Daniel was on the deed, and I said we hadn't gotten around to that yet, and she made a small sound that I can only describe as a note being filed. Not a reaction, a notation. I told myself it was nothing. She was from a generation that measured security in property. She worried about her son. It was harmless. I remember the Sunday in October, 6 weeks into our marriage, when she arrived 40 minutes early while I was still in the shower. Daniel let her in, of course, and by the time I came downstairs in my robe, hair wet against my shoulders, she was already in the kitchen, pouring herself tea from the pot I'd left warming on the stove. She looked up at me with that wide, warm smile and said, "I hope you don't mind, sweetheart. I know every corner of this kitchen already. Daniel showed me around last month." And I smiled back, because what else do you do? But something cold moved through me that I didn't name. I stood there in my own kitchen, dripping slightly onto my own floor, and felt, for the first time, like a guest. Daniel had shown her around, last month, while I'd been at work. I let that thought form, and then I let it go, the way you release a balloon, deliberately, with effort, telling yourself, it's better this way. That was my first mistake. Not the last, but the first. November arrived cold and wet, and with it came a shift I couldn't quite articulate. Eleanor began visiting more frequently, not every 2 weeks anymore, but nearly every week, and sometimes twice. She always had a reason. She'd made extra of something. She wanted to drop off a book. She was passing by and thought she'd say hello. Each visit was entirely plausible. Together they formed a pattern I couldn't prove was intentional, but that left me feeling, after every Sunday, slightly more erased than I had felt the Sunday before. She began rearranging things, gently, helpfully, always with a good reason. The mugs moved from the cabinet where I'd kept them for 2 years to a different shelf, closer to the coffee machine. Doesn't that make more sense, dear? The throw blankets I kept folded on the armchair appeared refolded in the wicker basket she'd brought as a gift. A piece of art I had hung in the hallway, a small oil painting I'd bought at a street market in Lisbon, the only painting I'd ever bought impulsively, just because it made me feel something, was rehung 2 inches lower because the sight line was off. When I moved it back, she rehung it lower again the following week, without mentioning it. I talked to Daniel about it once. We were in bed, the lamp still on, both of us reading, and I said, quietly and carefully, that I was finding the frequency of his mother's visits a little difficult. I said it exactly that way, a little difficult, the way you sand down the edges of a true thing to make it easier for someone to hold. He put his book down and looked at me with an expression of such genuine worry that my own certainty softened immediately. He said he understood. He'd talk to her. He'd figure out a way to give us more space. He kissed my temple and turned the lamp off and held me in the dark, and I thought, he heard me. He's on my side. He never talked to her. The visits continued. I told myself I had expected too much, that this was what adjusting to marriage looked like, that Eleanor would settle eventually and the rhythm would normalize. I bought a new painting, a print this time, nothing precious, and hung it where the Lisbon painting had been, and kept the original on my nightstand where it was just mine. In December, Eleanor began mentioning, casually, in passing, as though she were thinking out loud, that her apartment was becoming difficult to manage. Her knees had been bothering her. The stairs were steep. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, each time, with the specific emphasis of someone who wants you to argue with them. And we did argue. Kindly, as was expected. "No, Eleanor, you're never a burden. Of course not. You're doing beautifully." And she would smile and change the subject, and the conversation would feel resolved. It never was. I found out in January from Daniel's sister Kara, who called to wish us a Happy New Year, and let something slip in the easy, unguarded way of someone who assumes you already know, that Eleanor had already spoken to a realtor about her apartment, that she had, in fact, been weighing her options since September, that moving in with Daniel had been discussed, among Eleanor's close friends, as a near certainty. September. We had been married in August. I sat with the phone against my ear after Kara had hung up, and the kitchen was very quiet around me, the refrigerator humming, the tap dripping slightly, the specific silence of a house that is suddenly full of questions. I thought about the rearranged mugs. I thought about the painting. I thought about, I know every corner of this kitchen. I thought about all of those Sunday afternoons and the way Eleanor always positioned herself at the head of my kitchen table, naturally, without thinking, the way you settle into a chair that already belongs to you. I thought about Daniel, about the conversation he'd never had with her, about the apology he'd given me in the dark. I told myself I was catastrophizing. I told myself Kara might have misunderstood. I poured myself a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the small backyard garden I'd planted the summer before, and I made a decision that I now understand was the decision of someone who still believed that love was a reliable thing. I decided to trust my husband. 2 weeks later, Eleanor mentioned the stairs again, and then Daniel, gently, over dinner, as though the thought had just occurred to him, said, "Maybe we should think about having Mom stay with us for a while, just until spring. Her knees really are getting worse." I looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate. "In our house," I said. "Just temporarily," he said. He still wasn't looking at me. I wanted to say, "She's been planning this since September." I wanted to say, "You knew." I wanted to say, "Why are you looking at your plate?" Instead, I said I'd think about it and excused myself to do the dishes, and stood at the sink with hot water running over my hands long after they were clean. Eleanor moved in on a Tuesday in late January. She brought more than I expected: 7 boxes, a rolling suitcase, a lamp, and 2 framed photographs that appeared on the mantel without my being asked. She had the guest room, my home office as it had been, my drafting table squeezed into the bedroom corner to make space, and she settled into it with the practiced efficiency of someone unpacking into a space they've already furnished in their mind. Within a week, the kitchen had shifted again. The coffee was moved, the dish rack appeared on the wrong side of the sink. The lavender sachets materialized in the linen closet, replacing the cedar blocks I'd used for years. These were small things. I know how they sound when I list them. Small, petty even. But there is something that happens when small things accumulate into a texture, when every room you walk into has been touched by someone else's hands. A slow, grinding sense of dislocation that I can only compare to coming home to find that all the furniture has been moved 3 inches in every direction. Nothing is gone, nothing is broken, but nothing is where your body knows it should be, and you spend all day slightly off balance, catching yourself, correcting, exhausted by the effort of small, constant readjustments. Daniel saw none of it. Or he saw it and understood it differently, filtered it through a lens that made his mother's behavior look like love and my discomfort look like intolerance. When I raised it, and I raised it twice, 3 times, carefully worded, trying not to sound like the woman who resents her mother-in-law in the way that women have been resenting their mothers-in-law since time began, he listened. He nodded. He said he understood. And then he did nothing. And the next morning, the dish rack was still on the wrong side of the sink, and I understood that his listening and his understanding and his nods were not connected to any action, and that the gap between those words and the action was the gap I was falling into. The questions about the house continued, more specific now. Had I considered adding Daniel to the mortgage? What were the property tax rates in our area? Did I have a good relationship with the bank that held my mortgage? Did they know me there? Would they work with me if my circumstances changed? Each question arrived wrapped in a plausible reason. She was curious. She was thinking about her own finances. She'd read an article. And each one I deflected with a brief answer and a change of subject. While in my stomach, something that had been a small, uneasy flutter began to calcify into something colder and harder. I started noticing Daniel's phone. Not in the way of a jealous wife. It wasn't that. It was that I began to see him in the hallway, voice low, and when I appeared, he'd adjust his posture and finish the call and say, "Just Mum," with a smile that was ordinary and unremarkable. And I would think, "You talk to her on the phone even though she lives 20 feet from us." And I would think, "What do you talk about?" And I would think, "Why do you lower your voice?" I noticed in February that he had started taking his laptop into the study and closing the door. He worked from home twice a week and had always worked at the kitchen table. We'd both always worked at the kitchen table, side by side, comfortable and easy in each other's peripheral vision. The closed door was new. When I mentioned it, he said he was finding it hard to concentrate, that the house was livelier now, that he needed quiet for a project he was focused on. Reasonable. Entirely reasonable. I told myself it was reasonable. The night I found out, the real night, the night everything broke open, began like any other. It was the second Friday in February. Daniel had come home early with a bottle of wine and flowers, tulips, orange and yellow, the kind I liked. And we had cooked dinner together in the kitchen while Eleanor watched television in the living room, and it had felt like something I'd been missing for weeks. Ordinary warmth, the two of us in our kitchen, his shoulder against mine as we leaned over the cutting board. I'd thought, hopefully and stupidly, that the closeness of those hours meant something was shifting back toward us, that he'd noticed the distance and was choosing to close it. We ate together, the three of us, and Eleanor was charming that evening, funny even, telling a story about a neighbor from 30 years ago that had both Daniel and me genuinely laughing. She said goodnight early, kissing Daniel on the cheek and squeezing my hand, and Daniel and I cleared the table and opened a second glass of wine and sat in the living room, and it felt, for an hour, like before, like the ordinary golden life I'd thought was real. I fell asleep on the couch around 10:30, and Daniel must have carried me, or I walked half asleep, I don't remember exactly, to bed, because I woke up at midnight in the dark with my shoes off and the lamp out and a vague sense of displacement that I couldn't immediately explain. The house was quiet. Daniel's side of the bed was empty and cool, which meant he'd been up for a while. I lay there for a moment, listening. The house has a particular silence at midnight, denser than the silence of evening, heavier. I could hear the refrigerator from the kitchen, the occasional shift of the structure, the way old houses breathe. And then, underneath those sounds, something else. Voices. Low. Careful. Coming from the study, which was directly on the other side of the bedroom wall. I didn't decide to listen. I want to be clear about that, because I've asked myself since whether I was wrong to do what I did, whether I was already suspicious, whether I was looking for confirmation of something I'd already decided was true. I don't think so. I think I simply woke up at midnight and heard my husband talking to my mother-in-law in a closed room and felt the cold, unmistakable instinct that something was not right. I got up. I walked to the wall. I pressed my hand flat against it, cool plaster, slightly gritty under my palm, and I listened. Eleanor's voice first. She was speaking quietly, but with the measured pace of someone going through a list. I heard figures. I heard the word mortgage. I heard the deed. I heard, if we act before she adds him, and that she landed on me like something physical, a cold drop between the shoulder blades. Then Daniel's voice, lower, murmuring something I couldn't fully make out, and Eleanor's voice again, clearer, She won't push back if you present it the right way. She trusts you. That's the advantage. A pause. Daniel's murmur. And I caught the words, the timeline, and she'll understand eventually. And by the time she realizes, I don't know how long I stood there. Time had gone strange and elastic. I was aware of the cold floor under my feet, the plaster under my hand, the sound of my own breathing, which seemed very loud in my ears. I was also aware of a particular quality of stillness in my own mind, the way everything goes very clear and very still in the moment just before something breaks. I heard Eleanor say, "The beauty of it, Daniel, is that she signed nothing. If the house stays in her name alone, it's actually better for us. We can argue she gifted the right of habitation when she allowed me to move in. My lawyer says that, combined with a few months of documented residence and the mortgage adjustment," Daniel said something quickly, and she said, "Darling, I've already talked to Graham. It's handled. We just need a little more time." Graham, their family lawyer. She had already talked to their family lawyer. I stepped back from the wall. My foot caught the edge of the bed frame, and I grabbed the post to steady myself and stood there in the dark, in my own bedroom, in my own house, and felt the floor perform that slow, nauseous tilt that I can only describe as the body registering a truth the mind is still refusing to process. My hands were shaking. I could feel my pulse in my temples, in my throat, in my fingertips. The tulips he had brought, orange and yellow, the kind I liked, were in a vase on the dresser, and I could see them in the dark, just the pale shape of them, and I thought, he knew when he bought those that he was going to sit in that room with her tonight and plan this. He brought me flowers. I had two choices. I could walk into that room right now, throw the door open, let them see that I knew, or I could stand here and breathe and think. The thinking in that moment was the only power I had. I chose the thinking. I went back to bed. I lay down in the dark and pulled the covers up and closed my eyes, and when Daniel came back to bed 20 minutes later and curved himself against my back in the easy, automatic way of a man who believes his wife is asleep, I lay completely still and let him believe it. His breathing slowed and deepened. I stayed awake until 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, constructing the geography of what I now knew. Eleanor had been planning this since before the wedding, possibly since before we were engaged. The visits, the questions, the slow colonization of my kitchen, the move into my house, all of it had been staged. The warmth, the tears at the wedding, the "my little girl," all of it a performance. A long and patient performance of a woman embedding herself so deeply into a household that the household began to feel like hers. And Daniel, my Daniel, with his thoughtful gestures and his Sunday phone calls and his tulips, Daniel had known. Maybe not all of it, maybe not from the beginning, but he had known enough. He had sat in that room and discussed timelines and advantages and a lawyer named Graham. His silence when I raised concerns about his mother had not been passivity, it had been strategy. I thought about the deed, the house in my name, the mortgage I carried alone. I thought about Eleanor's phrase, "She signed nothing," and the particular satisfaction in her voice. She thought that was a vulnerability. She was planning to use my trust against me, to argue that I had implicitly shared ownership by allowing her to live here. It was, I had to admit it even then, cold and sick and awake at 4 in the morning, a plan. Not a fantasy, not a petty impulse. A plan with a lawyer and a timeline and a phrase like, "It's handled." By the time the sky began to lighten, I had made 3 decisions. First, I would not confront them yet. Not until I had spoken to someone who knew what I was dealing with legally. Not until I had documentation. Second, I would call my father in the morning. My father, who was a retired contractor and the most stubbornly practical man I had ever known, who had told me when I bought this house to keep every single piece of paper, and who had, it turned out, been right about everything. Third, I would make sure they never knew I'd been awake. I got up at 7 as usual, made coffee as usual, set 3 mugs out, as usual because Eleanor would be down within the hour, and stood at the kitchen window watching the backyard garden go from gray to pale gold in the early light. The lavender sachets had replaced my cedar blocks in the linen closet. The dish rack was on the wrong side of the sink. There was a photograph of Eleanor and Daniel as a child on the mantel of my living room. I looked at all of it with new eyes, and what I saw was not domesticity. It was occupation. Daniel came down at 7:30, kissed my cheek, poured himself coffee. He was relaxed, rested. He asked if I'd slept well, and I said I had, and smiled, and handed him his mug, and the smile cost me something I can't quite name, a kind of dignity I had to briefly set down in order to be strategic. He didn't notice anything. He never did notice the things I was feeling. I understood now that this quality I had mistaken for gentleness was actually a practiced incuriosity. He felt what he needed to feel about me and didn't look much further. Eleanor came down at 8. She was wearing a pale blue blouse and had her silver hair neat in its bun, and she smiled at me across the kitchen with that warm, tilted look and said, "You look rested, dear." And I thought, you sat 10 feet from where I sleep last night and discussed dismantling my life. "Thank you," I said. "So do you." I got through that morning on a kind of cold, clear fuel I hadn't known I possessed. I went to work. I sat through 2 meetings and made appropriate contributions and answered emails. At lunch, I called my father. My father picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, and I heard his voice, "Hey, kiddo," and something cracked in my chest. I sat in my car in the parking garage and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is not his natural tendency, which meant he understood it was serious. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Have you got a real estate attorney?" I said I didn't. He said, "I'll make some calls. Don't sign anything. Don't discuss the house with either of them. Don't let them know you know." And then he said, more quietly, "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I pressed my fingers against my eyes and held the tears back by sheer force of will, because I was in a parking garage and I had 2 more meetings and I could not afford to unravel. "Don't be sorry yet," I said. "Just help me." By Tuesday, he had given me the name of a real estate attorney named Patricia Okafor, who worked in family property disputes. I called her that afternoon from my car and described the situation, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You need to come in. Today, if possible." The urgency in her voice, controlled, professional, but unmistakable, told me that what I was describing was not paranoid. It was a pattern she recognized. I met her Wednesday afternoon. She had an office on the 4th floor of a building downtown with a waiting room that smelled of new carpet and old coffee. And she was a small, composed woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the kind of focused attention that makes you feel simultaneously seen and protected. I brought everything: the deed, the mortgage documents, every piece of paper I had kept in the accordion file under my bed since the day I'd closed on the house. She went through them with the practiced speed of someone who has done this many times, and when she looked up, she said, "The good news is that this house is legally yours, unambiguously. Nothing they can say to a court will change that." I exhaled. "The less good news," she continued, "is that if Eleanor has been documenting her residency, utility usage, any kind of regular financial contribution to the household, even informal records of caring for the home, she may be positioning to claim a right of habitation, which is different from ownership, but which creates legal complications. How long has she been living with you?" 3 weeks, I said. Patricia nodded. "Then we need to move. I'll prepare a formal notice of residence for her, which documents her status as a guest rather than a resident. I'll also draft a letter for the bank about the existing mortgage structure. And I want you to start documenting everything. Every conversation about the property, every change made to the house, everything." She paused. "Is your husband willing to cooperate?" I thought about the closed door, the lowered voice. "No," I said. "I don't think he is." She looked at me steadily. "Then we treat this as an adversarial situation. You need to be prepared for that." I drove home in the dark and sat in my car in front of my house for a long time. The lights were on in the living room. I could see the shadow of movement through the curtains. Eleanor, probably, or Daniel, the two of them inside my house that they were planning to take from me, with timelines and lawyers and the patient, lethal leverage of my own trust. I had a choice. I was still making it, but I was no longer making it blind. I kept the secret for 9 more days. 9 days of coffee at 7, of setting 3 mugs out, of saying, "Good night, Eleanor," with a smile that fit over my face like a mask I was getting frighteningly good at wearing. 9 days of lying next to Daniel in the dark and listening to him breathe and feeling the specific, grinding grief of a love becoming something you have to dismantle. I want to be honest about that grief because it was real, even inside the anger. I had loved him. I had loved who I thought he was. The mourning for that version of him ran alongside everything else like a second river, cold and quiet and constant. Patricia worked fast. By the end of the first week, she had prepared the notice of residence, establishing Eleanor's guest status, a letter to my bank protecting the existing mortgage structure in my sole name, and a memo documenting the timeline of Eleanor's move and the concerns I had raised. She also told me something that stopped me cold in my chair. She had done a preliminary search of public filings and found that Eleanor's family lawyer, Graham Westfield, had filed a preliminary inquiry with the county about joint household residency rights just 12 days ago. 12 days, 3 weeks after Eleanor moved in. Patricia had found the filing in under an hour. It was the filing that changed my thinking from grief into something harder. Because the filing meant that Eleanor hadn't merely discussed a plan in a room at midnight. She had already initiated legal machinery. The timeline they'd whispered about had a clock on it, and it was running, and I had been sleeping in the same house as these two people, making coffee, setting out 3 mugs, while that clock ticked. I called my father that night from the backyard, standing in the cold in my coat with the garden brown and bare around me, and I told him about the filing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When?" "This weekend," I said. "I want them both there." "I'll come," he said immediately. No negotiation, no question. "You don't have to." "I'll come," he repeated, with the flat finality of a man who has made up his mind. "Sunday. I'll be there by noon." I had one more thing to do before Sunday. One more thing I'd been turning over in my mind since that midnight, a thread I hadn't been able to stop pulling at. I needed to understand how long Daniel had known. I waited until Friday evening when Eleanor had gone to her book club, a 2-hour window, and asked Daniel to sit with me in the kitchen. He sat across from me in the way he always had, easy and unguarded, and I looked at him for a moment before I spoke, trying to see beneath the familiar face to whatever had always been underneath. He looked back at me with clear, affectionate eyes. I had a sudden, nauseating certainty that he had no idea I knew, that he had compartmentalized the whole thing so thoroughly that it simply didn't register as a betrayal when he looked at his wife across the kitchen table. "How are you feeling about your mom staying with us?" I asked, casually, the way you sand down the edges. "Good," he said. "I think she's settling in, don't you?" "She seems comfortable," I said. "How long were you thinking she'd stay?" A brief pause, barely detectable. "We said through spring originally, but honestly, I've been thinking." He looked at the table for just a moment, then back up. "I think it might make more sense for her to stay longer. Maybe permanently, actually. She's not getting younger, and the stairs at her apartment—" "Permanently," I said. "I know we haven't talked about it formally. Daniel," I kept my voice very level, "have you spoken to Graham Westfield?" The pause this time was not brief. It was the pause of a man recalibrating, reaching for a story to stand behind. I watched it happen on his face, the small, barely visible work of deciding what to admit. "He's just a family lawyer," he said finally. "We needed some advice." "About my house," I said. "About—" He stopped, looked at the table again. His jaw had tightened. "Sarah—" "About the deed," I said. "About the mortgage. About Eleanor's residency rights. About a timeline." I let each word land separately, quietly, like small stones dropped into still water. His face, which had been carefully composed, was coming undone in a way I found almost hard to watch. Not because I felt sorry for him in that moment, because it was the face of someone being caught, and caught people look like children, ashamed and scrambling. And even now, even knowing what I knew, some part of me mourned the person I had thought he was. "I can explain," he said. "You knew," I said. "You knew before she moved in. You knew when you suggested she move in. You knew when you came to bed with flowers and asked if I'd slept well." My voice was so steady it scared me slightly. "You knew." He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the table. The refrigerator hummed. The tap dripped. Outside the window, the garden was dark and bare. "I just wanted everyone to be okay," he said, finally, in a voice so small it barely fit in the room. "Everyone," I said, "except me." He didn't answer that. There was nothing to say to it, because it was the truth, and we both knew it, and the silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Sunday. My father arrived at noon in his truck, driving 4 hours from the town where I grew up, wearing his good jacket the way he wore it to things that mattered. He shook Daniel's hand in the doorway with the polite, measured grip of a man who has formed a judgment and is keeping it controlled. And he kissed my cheek and held me for 1 second longer than usual, and that second was enough. I didn't fall apart, but I felt, for the first time in weeks, that I was not entirely alone. Eleanor joined us in the living room at Daniel's request. She came in with her reading glasses on her head and her pale blue blouse and her warm, tilted look. And when she saw my father, she smiled the smile of a woman accustomed to charming older men, extended her hand, said how lovely to finally meet him. My father shook her hand and said nothing beyond a greeting, and sat down in the armchair that she usually sat in. I had asked him to specifically. And Eleanor took the sofa, and I sat beside my father, and Daniel sat in the remaining chair with the slightly rigid posture of a man who knows something is about to happen and doesn't know which direction the blow is coming from. I had printed 3 documents and placed them in a folder on the coffee table. "I wanted us to sit together," I began, "because there are some things I think we all need to be clear about." I kept my voice exactly as level as it had been in the kitchen with Daniel on Friday. That specific coldness that isn't anger so much as absolute clarity. I opened the folder. "This is the title deed to this house, showing sole ownership in my name. This is a letter from my attorney confirming the mortgage structure and protective notice filed last week regarding any external residency claims." I looked at Eleanor. "And this is a public record filing made by Graham Westfield on February 4th, 12 days after you moved in, regarding joint household residency rights." The room was absolutely still. Eleanor's face had not moved. That was the most telling thing. Her face had not moved. There was no surprise, no confusion, no flush of embarrassment. Just the slight hardening of features that happens when a calculated person realizes their calculation has been seen. "Eleanor," I said, "I heard you and Daniel on Thursday night, through the wall." Daniel made a sound, a kind of compressed exhale, halfway between a word and a groan, and put his hand over his face. Eleanor looked at him sharply once, and then looked back at me, and what I saw in her eyes then was not regret. It was the measuring look she'd always given me when she thought I wasn't watching, stripped of its performance, nothing underneath it but the cold appraisal of a problem to be managed. "Sarah," she said, still warm, still modulated, still faintly maternal, "I think you've let some anxiety about—" "Don't," I said. One word. She stopped. She stopped. "I want you to understand what that felt like, after months of swallowing and adjusting and telling myself I was overreacting, to say one word and watch her stop. The power was small and quiet, and it was mine. My attorney has notified your lawyer that the residency filing has no legal basis," I said. "My bank has been briefed. The deed is secured. There is nothing to pursue. I closed the folder and set it on the table between us. What I need from you is a decision. I'm prepared to offer Eleanor 30 days to arrange alternative housing, with no legal action for the filing if she leaves without contest. I looked at Daniel. What happens with us is a different conversation, and we will have it privately. Eleanor looked at her son. Daniel was looking at his hands. You would put your mother-in-law out of, Eleanor began. You are my guest, I said. You have been my guest for 3 weeks. You used those 3 weeks to file a legal claim against my property with a lawyer you'd briefed before you arrived. You're not my mother-in-law in any meaningful sense right now. You're someone who tried to take my house. The room was so quiet that when a car passed outside, we all heard it clearly. 30 days, that's my offer. Eleanor stood. She stood in the way of a woman who has decided that dignity requires verticality, and she looked down at me with an expression that had given up the pretense of warmth entirely. What was underneath was not ugly exactly. It was simply the face of someone accustomed to winning who has not yet adjusted to having lost. You have no idea, she said quietly, how much Daniel has sacrificed to— Mom, Daniel said. His voice was very low. Stop. She looked at him. He was looking at her now, and his face was the face of a man arriving very late at a decision he should have made months ago. Whatever passed between them in that look, I can't fully describe. I can say that Eleanor sat back down and that she said nothing more, and that the room stayed quiet for a long moment. My father drove her to a hotel that afternoon. He offered, said he'd be glad to help, said it in his flat, practical way that made it clear the offer was not optional. Eleanor accepted with the compressed graciousness of someone managing a loss and packed a bag while Daniel and I sat in the kitchen not speaking, and the house was very quiet after the front door closed. Daniel and I talked for 4 hours that night. I won't describe all of it. Some of it was grief, and some was anger, and some was the exhausting circular work of two people trying to determine what is left when trust has been removed from the center of a thing. He told me, and I believed him, which I didn't want to, because believing him complicated the clean anger I had preferred, that he had not thought of it as a plan, that he had allowed his mother to move through the world making arrangements as she always had, because allowing it had always been easier than fighting it, that he had known about the lawyer, but told himself it was just preliminary, just exploratory, that it would come to nothing, that he had loved me the whole time. I told him that love isn't a defense, that his love for me had been, in practice, consistently less important to him than his need not to displease his mother, that the silence he called keeping peace was something I had lived inside like a room with no windows. He wept. I didn't then. I had used up whatever was available for weeping in the 9 days of setting out 3 mugs and wearing the mask. I told him I needed time. He moved to a hotel for 2 weeks while I sat with the house, my house, in my name, with the deed in the folder Patricia had given me, and figured out what I wanted. My father visited on weekends and made things with his hands, the way he always had when he didn't know what to say. He rehung the Lisbon painting in the hallway at exactly the height I had chosen, replaced the cedar blocks in the linen closet, moved the dish rack back to its proper side of the sink. Eleanor left no formal contest. Patricia had been clear enough about the legal position that Graham Westfield, apparently, had advised against it. She moved to a senior living community 2 towns over. Kara told me this, carefully, tentatively, clearly uncertain whether to maintain contact with me. And I was told she described the situation to her friends as a misunderstanding. I didn't argue with the version. It wasn't important anymore. What happened with Daniel is more complicated than a clean ending. We went to couples counseling, 12 weeks of it, in a beige office on Thursday evenings, with a therapist named Dr. Maines, who had the patient, undramatic manner of someone who has heard every version of this story and holds none of it against anyone. What emerged over those 12 weeks was a portrait of a dynamic I had missed because I had been too close to it. Daniel's relationship with his mother was older than I was, more deeply grooved, and the patterns of appeasement she had trained into him ran so deep they had become invisible to him. He had not maliciously betrayed me. He had passively allowed a betrayal to take shape around him, because confronting it would have required a kind of courage he had never been taught to have. That is not the same as innocence. I want to be clear about that. Passive participation is still participation. His silence was not neutral. The flowers he brought the night they sat in the study and talked about timelines. I have not forgotten the flowers. I don't think I will. We are still married. I want to be honest about that too, because the story of the woman who threw her unfaithful husband out and started over fresh and was better for it is satisfying in a way that happens to not be what occurred. What occurred is that I married someone who turned out to be more complicated than I knew, and who hurt me more than I could have imagined, and who is also trying in ways that are genuine and sometimes adequate and sometimes not. We are a work in progress. Some days the kitchen feels like ours again. Some days I set the coffee mugs out and feel, briefly, the ghost of a third mug where I'll never put one. What I lost is a kind of innocence about trust, the assumption that care is care until proven otherwise, that warmth is warmth, that love is a reliable structure rather than something that requires ongoing verification. I don't think I'll ever fully get that back, and I'm not sure I want to, because it was also a vulnerability that cost me nearly everything. What I have is the deed, still in my name. The Lisbon painting at the height I chose, cedar in the linen closet, the dish rack on the right side of the sink, a backyard garden that, when spring came, I replanted entirely, new beds, new arrangements, nothing where it had been before, and which bloomed that summer in colors I had chosen for no one but myself. I stood on the back step in June, coffee mug warm against my palms, looking at what I had grown, and I thought about Eleanor saying, "She won't push back if you present it the right way. She trusts you. That's the advantage." I thought about how she had been right about all of it except the conclusion. I had trusted him. It had been used against me. And I had survived it. Not undamaged, not unchanged, not without grief and loss and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding something inside myself that her plan had never anticipated. The thing that made me press my palm to the wall instead of crying, call my father at dawn, sit in Patricia's office with every piece of paper I'd been keeping in a folder under my bed since the day I'd closed on this house. The lavender sachets are gone. The photographs are gone. The chair at the head of my kitchen table is mine. Some mornings, that is enough. Some mornings, it is more than enough. The garden is beautiful. I grew it myself.